I'm not saying against trade. I want to make sure that people are clear on that. I'm not saying we shouldn't trade. I'm just saying we should be strategic in our trade. I think Trump did a good idea, but I think we've been taken advantage of, and I'm not sure if we can even come back.
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a former guest. He's actually been on the show twice already. It's his third time, and it's none other than John Hendrickson. John, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
Thank you, Vance. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be to have you on the show and to talk with you again. I had you on. I think it was Let People Prosper episode like 15. Yes. Now we're at 114. So that's, 100 episodes. It's pretty wild. And I've been on your show. You've interviewed me, for one of your capstone projects. And so, and then I posted that on my Let People Prosper show as well. So, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your podcast. I mean, you've interviewed some great people, and you have a great program. So I'm glad that it's an honor to be a part of it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, John. And we've been friends for a long time. And so I'm glad that you're doing well and, continue to fight the good fight. So keep that going.
Yeah.
Before we get too far though, for the audience, let me go ahead and read your bio just so in case they missed the first one after that was 100 episodes ago, and then we'll jump right into it. Okay, so John Hendrickson joined the Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation team in 2017. Before becoming policy director for ITR Foundation, Hendrickson served as a research analyst with the Public Interest Institute, a public policy research group, and as a researcher for the Heritage Foundation. His articles have been published in many newspapers across Iowa, including the Des Moines Register, Cedar Park Gazette, and others. Hendrickson earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees in history from the University of North Dakota. He specializes in American political and constitutional history. And he's just a fantastic guy overall, as you'll find out throughout our discussion today. And we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the Constitution, with this being Constitution Day was this week. We're also going to talk about trade and tariffs and some disagreements we have along the way. What about the new right and Republicans for the future? And then, of course, Iowa as being a beacon of prosperity in many ways. These are the things we're going to talk about today. But before we get to all that, John, I've asked you before what motivates you to do what you do. So let me ask it this way. What's motivating you lately to do what you do every day?
Yeah, well, I have to say it's the same thing. I come to this job with a deep passion and respect for American history. And I think we're at a fundamental crossroads right now in our nation's history. And I look at, especially in this current presidential election, of what some of the ideas that are being proposed. I mean, not just from a fiscal standpoint, but from, for example, you and I were going to talk a little bit about the Constitution, but there's the Democrats are talking about getting rid of the Electoral College. I think that would be a disaster if that happens. And so I think, especially as we think about the Constitution this week, one thing that motivates me to be doing this line of work is in a sense, we need to preserve our form of government, and not just our Constitution, but also our to defend our history. And we're seeing I would say a progressive onslaught against our nation's past and against the Constitution. In fact, just recently we've seen op-eds in some of the nation's largest newspapers talking about how we need to reimagine our democracy and that the Constitution's obsolete and we need basically to throw it out and have something new. And that's pretty alarming.
Yeah. No, I agree with John. And it's been interesting, this election cycle, and maybe the last couple of election cycles, where we've seen more of this on display, not looking at history, not looking at policy. It's been a lot more about populism and other things, and we can get into some of that. But there's been less discussion about the importance of the Constitution, the importance of our history. And I think that's what's so great about it. We're going to have a good, cordial discussion here in a little bit about trade. There's a lot of history with that. And then once we understand the history, though, we can have better disagreements.
That's right. Yeah.
And agreements where we can. And I think do you think this is maybe one reason why the the two major parties, Republicans, Democrats, or conservatives and progressives, seem so far apart is that we're too often forgetting a lot of our history. Do you think that contributes to it?
I do. I think so. And I think we're so much focusing on today, and that we forget to look at the past. We forget to learn from it. And that leads to a lot of not only division, but just, it just creates a lot of problems. And I think if we just, and look, we're never going to find total agreement on issues, but I think we can find some, a lot of maybe even common ground on some things if we look at our nation's history. In fact, just this morning I was having coffee with one of my colleagues, and we were actually talking with his father on speakerphone, and he was just sharing about his experience in Iowa in the 1950s, and just that everyone had sort of a common. The idea of a faith in God was not controversial then.
Yeah.
And today that is. And he was just sharing that. And today, there, in a sense, religious liberty is one of those things that's under assault.
Yeah.
And in the 1950s, that wasn't the case. I mean, that we had, we were a nation that was unified with a common culture, a common language, a common history. And we're seeing that come apart now.
Yeah. Yeah, great points there. And, it's unfortunate. I mean, of course, we want things to improve. I don't know that I would want to go back to the 1950s, John. I like where we're at today and using technology and everything else. But there certainly are some things that could be better of what was happening then compared to today. One of those being faith. One of those being family and the family unit being a core institution along with the church. It seems like we're getting away from that, where too often, it seems like government becomes the head of the family, and that's contributing to a lot of poverty and other issues that's going on. But at the same time, if you get away from community, if you get away from churches and synagogues or whatever your faith is, a lot of that ends up becoming a situation that leads to worse outcomes, as you mentioned, but also more crime, more poverty, a lot of other economic ills and social ills to go along with it. And so I wonder, though, given your background in history and study of it, what are some of the key things within the Constitution as we're celebrating this week with Constitution Day and everything else in America? What are some of the pillars in the Constitution that help to get us to where we are today, and maybe that we need to start getting back to?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to go there. And one is, I mean, just sort of rediscovering the mechanics of the Constitution, whether that's checks and balances, separation of powers. For example, I think over time, Congress has ceded a lot of authority to the executive branch. And so whether you want to call it the deep state or the bureaucracy, the administrative state, a lot of our decisions are being made by the unelected bureaucrats. And this is one big reason why a lot of people are celebrating the Chevron decision, that maybe that will start rolling back, some of this regulatory burden. And so we need to go back to what did the founders really mean by separation of powers and checks and balances? And the other thing is going back to federalism. Federalism was one of my favorite, he's passed on, but one of my favorite constitutional scholars was James McClellan. And he talked about federalism being sort of woven through the Constitution. And, the Electoral College is an example of federalism. And it's, another thing, Vance, I think it's a crime, really, is that, we're not teaching we're not teaching history anymore. We're not teaching government. Yeah. And so we're really having a lost generation of people that are ignorant of our nation's past or they're ignorant of our government, our institutions, and that's hurting. And so there's a lot of people that don't realize how important the Electoral College is. And you have one political party that basically is championing itself as the defenders of democracy, the Democrats, which I think is completely false, and they're trying to undermine that. But, going back to those mechanics, and, I think one key revolutionary change that occurred was during the 1930s with the New Deal. when Franklin Roosevelt was able to remake the court, and you had a New Deal majority that came on the Supreme Court, and you basically had a revolution that took over, and Roosevelt's progressives came on, and basically, the rest is history, as they say, and you start seeing the growth of the administrative state as a result. And prior to that, the court and even some progressive judges were striking down some of these New Deal programs, like the NRA and the AAA. And the court was actually enforcing, key things like federalism and separation of powers and checks and balances. And we need to go back and rediscover some of those truths. And so the other thing is it's a cultural issue too. And so we can't just rely on having good judges in place is obviously an important thing, but we also need to become a people that as a culture that we're committed to the Constitution again. Yeah,
no, great points. And I think wise words overall. And I think what we are looking at, right, is whenever you have the Constitution, which was historic, right, given the time that it was in, and moving away from having a king, someone who is in charge, but having three branches of government, having this system of federalism that takes away or moves a lot more power to the states or to ultimately to the people, compared to a centralized federal government, was very different from everything else that's been before that. And I think that's one reason why we've been so strong as a country. And so I think you're exactly right that when we start losing sight of where we've been and what the history is and our constitutional limited roles for government, then we cease to be that shining city on a hill that's been talked about before, and we turn into a lot of the other countries. And I'm concerned that when you look at a lot of the things you brought up, the bureaucracy, where Congress has basically gave a lot of that power to the regulatory state. And I saw that when I was at the White House, John, when I was at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. In the Trump administration, we actually had a lot more power than what I ever thought to figure out what the rules are going to be and regulations, because a lot of what Congress passes in their budget, in their bills, right, ends up being very vague. And that leaves a lot of room for the executive branch to have more power, rightly or wrongly. I kind of think wrongly, but rightly or wrongly. And so I'm interested to see, John, I'd love to get your take on this, whether or not Congress will start to make their bills and their laws less vague. Because if they just keep doing what they're doing, I think they will still cede a lot of power to the regulatory state. Do you think that's right?
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I tend to be a pessimist, but I don't know if Congress is going to do that, because I think they're so used to ceding that authority and sort of, I don't know if you want to call it passing the buck, or if it's just easier for them to say, let the bureaucracy handle it. And whether the Democrats are in control of the Republicans, both sides tend to do that. Yeah. And both political parties tend to look at, prefer a very strong executive. And so now you even see within conservative circles, a lot of conservatives saying, we need a strong executive. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, I think it was James Burnham, I'd have to look again, but wrote a book about, Congress, the importance of Congress as an institution. But I think that's one place to start. And I remember, the brother of William F. Buckley, James Buckley, wrote a book, and he was a great defender of federalism, but basically talking about all the growth of the federal government since the New Deal. And basically that was what it was. Congress just kept ceding more and more authority to the executive branch. And this is what is happening. Wow. You just get this massive Leviathan, and it also has implications for us at the states, as you know as well, because when you talk to state legislators, it ties the hands of states, because a lot of times when state legislators are trying to make budget decisions, the federal funds are manipulating what states can and cannot do. And so a lot of times, they're even tied to what, Uncle Sam tells them to do. And then, the other thing that concerns me is, how much can we continue to increase the national debt? Yeah. And I think we, as a culture, we've become numb to this. And so we just continue to hit these milestones. Well, 35 trillion, and no one really seems to care. How much can we continue to just ratchet up this debt before the whole thing collapses?
Yeah, it's a great point. And as you know, and I've been working on this a lot with the sustainable budgeting and different things, even at the federal level, that I think we need a spending limit. If we don't start to rein in government spending, it goes back to the point, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. We've got to get control over this somehow. And I know it's politically unpopular to talk about, reforms that you need maybe to Social Security and Medicare, which I think those reforms should also help preserve it for the people who are closer to retirement and who have expected those benefits to come to them. Now, younger than that, I think there's some wiggle room of what we need to do, but those are the two driving areas, and that's 2/3 of the budget, just between those two programs. And if you don't have those on the table, it makes it very difficult to do much with the budget situation over time. And then we're running $1 trillion a year in just net interest payments on the debt. And if interest rates stay up longer, like they seem like they will, they may come down here pretty soon if the Fed decides to cut interest rates in September. But either way, they're still going to be pretty high for a while. I think we're going to see even more interest on the debt over time. And so this is a major issue that I agree with you needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. There's a lot of talk about tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, which should be extended, which I think that they should. There's some talks about tariffs, which we're going to get into in a little bit. There's talks about exempting Social Security income and tips, and then child tax credit. There's a lot of discussion on the tax side, but we've got to focus again on the spending side, because if we don't, we're going to continue to run the massive deficits over time, and this is going to be a major problem. And John, to your point, though, which is a great one, is that most people will just not care. Like, $35 trillion. What does that mean to you? But we're seeing the effects of this today with the higher interest rates, with the higher inflation. All of this stuff kind of goes together on the macro economy, that it distorts the economy and different orders of production throughout the economy, which makes us weaker in the process. We just had a jobs report that came out pretty weak, about 140,000 jobs that were added in the month of August. But the revision for June and July was down 89,000 jobs. And we just had a revision down of 1 million jobs. So we have a weak economy, and they wonder why. Well, it's a lot of this big government spending. How do you think we can ever get control over it?
Well, I don't know if we can, and I hate to say that, but I call this the New Deal dilemma, because I think this is Franklin Roosevelt fundamentally altered American government, and I think this is a cultural problem in the long run, because and whether it's at the local level, when we're looking at local taxes such as the property taxes, or at the federal level, people want and expect a lot from government, and they, in a sense, don't want to pay for it. And the demands of government are increasing. And what's happening is that people don't want to pay for it. They want someone else to pay for it. And so politicians are responding to that by basically, so for example, no tax on tips, or, I'm going to expand the child tax credit $5,000. Well, then Kamala Harris says, well, I'm going to expand it by $6,000. And so now we have a bidding war going on.
Right.
And so, what's on the endangered species list, Vance?
What's that?
Is budget hawks.
There you go.
You might have been the only budget hawk out there, when you're out there in DC, that's the problem, is that there's a cultural problem, is that, I don't really know if people really want limited government. And we hear this, property tax is a huge issue here in Iowa, as I know you're doing this in Texas, and also working on this in a number of states. But, we hear this all the time. People don't want to pay property taxes, but at the same time, they say, I'm a senior citizen, I shouldn't have to pay property taxes. But then what does that do? That shifts the burden to someone else.
Yep.
And so you have in a sense, this class warfare going on, and so, but then the demands of government keep growing, and so then we get into this problem where government keeps increasing, and we're also running out of ways to pay for it.
Yeah.
Because you can't. If Vice President Harris wins and she gets her ways on taxes, we're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
she's already talked about, not extending the Trump tax cuts.
Yes.
Especially for those under $400,000 a year. And then also raising the corporate tax rate up to 28%, raising the capital gains tax rate up to 28%, even if not higher. These are all detrimental to growth. And as you know, and have been writing a lot about, and we've been writing a lot about, is economic growth is also an important part here. You need growth and spending restraint. Those two things can do a lot for a city or a state or the federal government. And in order for us to get additional growth, we've got to make sure that we have sound tax policy, which means sound fiscal spending policy, and regulatory policy too. So it's a major issue that I wish they would talk more about, because I think you made a good point there, though, how we're going extinct, us budget hawks, and we need more of them out there. And sometimes I think we get a bad rap because, like, well, you're just saying no. And it's not about saying no. It's about saying yes to the future.
Yes.
Because if we say yes to everything today, we will not have a bright and prosperous future, right?
No, absolutely not. And just look at the states that have tried to tax and spend their way to prosperity, whether it's our neighbors, Minnesota and Illinois or California and New York, or look at these, other countries that have, these socialist countries. If that model
Venezuela,
worked, history proves that model doesn't work.
Yep.
And so we can't simply, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society didn't work. The New Deal didn't work. In a sense, the New Deal was sort of a Band-Aid on a problem, and it didn't do anything. It just, it just made the situation worse to a certain extent. It didn't solve unemployment. It didn't heal the Great Depression. It made it worse.
Yep, that's exactly right. What they often call it is market failures. And so they need government to come in to solve the market failure, but they're overlooking the fact that it's usually a government failure, not a market failure. And so if you bring government in to solve a government problem, then you exacerbate. To your point, you make it worse. You exacerbate the problem. And we get the situation that we have today where many people are not working. Labor force participation rate remains low. It's back up to where it was pre-pandemic as far as 25 to 54-year-olds, the prime age group. But baby boomers are over 55 now, right? And if they're down, along with 16 to 24-year-olds, you're still losing a lot of people that are in the early stages of their career, and a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge and wisdom in the latter part of their career that have basically dropped out. And that's a huge detriment to our economy and to the future. And it hurts a lot of these other programs like Social Security and Medicare, in the process of having less revenue that's being put into the system. So, there's a lot we could talk about at the federal level, and I want to come back to that. But let's highlight some of the good things, as you mentioned a little bit, but in Iowa, where you do a lot of great work along with the great team there at Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation. I should mention I'm a fellow there. So yes. I work with you on a lot of issues, and we just put out a great report on property tax relief. But I think what's interesting about Iowa is the transition, especially under Governor Kim Reynolds, to a much more fiscally conservative path. The way that I think you and others have been working on this with the conservative Iowa budget and reining in government spending and the great work that Kim Reynolds and the legislature have been doing. But then also now that gives the opportunity for school choice, for property tax relief, and a lot of other things because of sound economic and fiscal policy. But what are some of the other things, or just expand on those, but what are the things that you really like to highlight about Iowa?
Well, it's really a miracle of the Midwest, and in fact, Iowa has done a tremendous thing. In fact, it's a little frustrating sometimes because we're sort of forgotten, and a lot of attention gets put on states like Florida and even Texas for the stuff they're doing. But I really think Iowa's done some tremendous things, and a lot of it is because of our legislature and Governor Kim Reynolds. When she took office, we had some of the highest income tax rates in the nation. Our top individual rate was close to 9%. We once had the highest corporate rate at 12%. Now starting in January of this coming year, we'll have a flat 3.8% income tax. So we've replaced a multi-progressive income tax with a flat, income tax rate, and our corporate tax rate is now 7.1%. That's
John, real quick. So you just said that the highest rate was 9%.
Yes. Yeah.
And now 3.5%. Its blunt
3.8.
rate.
Yeah. Yep. 3.8.
3.8%.
Yes.
I mean, that's substantial. That's cutting it in half.
Yes. Yeah.
For each one of those marginal dollars that are being brought in, that brings about more incentives and growth and everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge.
And the story behind that is they did this all by prudent budgeting, and they did not cut government to do this. In fact, we have been running surpluses almost every fiscal year. In fact, even projecting into fiscal year 2025, we're projected to be running surpluses because the legislature and Governor Reynolds have been practicing prudent budgeting. And what that has allowed them to make, in a sense, pro-growth tax reforms. The other thing that she's done is that doesn't get a lot of attention is that she has made historic reforms to state government. And it's not the most exciting topic, but for example, she's made the first major reform in nearly 40 years of state government. And so she has eliminated and consolidated state government agencies, and there's all kinds of measures going on to clean up state government, making things more efficient. And that's going to save taxpayer dollars. There's a place to start going through. Iowa has numerous boards and commissions, and some of those are going to be eliminated and consolidated. We've just are going through a process to evaluate our rules and regulations. And so there's a process in place to sort of reduce the regulatory burden, which will be good for our economy. We've made some good progress in reforming occupational licensing reforms. Yep. And so, really all this started with conservative budgeting.
Yep.
And,
yep.
And so,
it has ripple effects, right? You start in one spot, and then that leaves you to more room to then work on other areas, right?
Yeah. And this is why the Cato Institute ranked her the most fiscally conservative governor in the report they released. I think it was 2 years ago they released that, and it's every couple of years they release that. They ranked her the top fiscally conservative governor in the nation for that very reason.
Wow. Yeah, it's phenomenal how much that things can change when you have that approach. When you have that fiscal conservative, that prudent budgeting approach is just huge, and something that, we look at sometimes, right, is the economic freedom of North America. Just looking at this, the latest report was 27th for Iowa, but it's continuing to improve. And my guess is it'll move up even more after the latest reforms have been made. And so that also indicates to me that there are key reforms that are moving in the right direction. And what's interesting too, John, is that we've had this kind of flat tax revolution that's happening across the country. So it also is all relative, like the Economic Freedom of North America is relative. It's a great report. I recommend it. But it also means that other states are improving at the same time. And so you've got to make sure that you're even more competitive.
That's right.
In this playing field, in this laboratory of competition and federalism, like we brought back the Constitution and everything now, piecing it all together, right? But this is so important for the future of the country that other states need to be looking at states like Iowa and saying, you know what, this is working. The unemployment rates are remaining low, poverty rates are being reduced. There are other economic benefits to this than just the size and scope of government. Because if the thing is that if we could just spend more and run massive deficits and raise taxes or whatever else we need to do, and we saw lower poverty and better outcomes, that might be against our view. But what we've seen throughout history and throughout the states and other countries is that when you spend more, you get worse outcomes, not better outcomes. Yeah. And so I think this is so important to really drive the point home about Iowa really being a place for people to look at for the future. Are there certain things that you think are going to happen in the next couple of years that will make Iowa even more competitive?
Oh, I think so, because not only just from that, that economic climate that's improving for, in terms of our regulatory climate and our tax climate, but also I think we're making some progress on the property tax front, because I think Tax Foundation rated us the 10th highest in the nation in terms of property tax. But, in terms of education, we're making some progress. We have a very impressive school choice bill with universal ESAs, and we have also expanded open enrollment and charter schools and so on. And that was in response. Iowans after COVID demanded more school choice. And that was in response to demands. And the governor fought for parents. And she got criticized for that because she stood up against a lot of Republicans in her own party who were blocking that. she got involved in primaries, which wasn't more popular, but she stood up for choice and education freedom. So I think that's going to be appealing to a lot of, and I know this is controversial, Vance, but I think Iowa, Governor Reynolds has really stood up to fight the woke agenda. And I know that a lot of people will find that controversial, but I think a lot of people find that refreshing because, there's a lot of, for example, in Minnesota, there's a lot of revolutionary things taking place, like legalizing marijuana, things like that. And that's not happening in Iowa. And so the governor has been defending, I would say, sort of traditional Midwestern values that I think people, are very much thankful for that she's doing.
Yeah.
And so I think that, between our more competitive economic climate, the opportunities for education and, making Iowa a very good place to raise a family, this is going to, the state there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah.
I'm seeing, even Iowa has challenges. We're not seeing a population growth like Florida or Texas, but we're a rural state. We're just like other Midwestern states, a lot of ag states, rural areas are struggling with population, and those are for that's a different topic for a different day because that's a different issue because that's been going on for a long time. But when you look at, for example, the Des Moines Metro, it's booming here. There's a lot of people moving here.
Nice. Good. Yeah. And these sort of pro-growth policies will help to attract more people and businesses.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of pushing the other direction.
Yeah. And what's happening in our neighbors, Illinois, Minnesota, people are leaving. People are leaving those states, and we're getting the benefit from that. South Dakota is benefiting from that. And even Wisconsin, which is not a tax-friendly state, even they're getting people from Minnesota because people are sick and tired of the high taxes.
Yeah. Now, I was just kind of looking over some of the things. So Americans for Tax Reform, they have a website that I've helped put together on the budget project. So it's atr.org/budget project. And you can go through and you can look at each state. So if you look at Iowa, it shows Economic Freedom North America and how the budget's ranking and state and local tax burden and all this other stuff. And what's interesting about that is that in a lot of ways, Iowa is about middle of the pack in a lot of these areas, if not worse, like you said, on property tax burden. But those things have been improving. And that is what you want to see out of a state, because if you're sitting back on your laurels, just like what I tell about Texas, is Texas does a lot of things right? But if you sit back on your laurels, things can go in a bad direction quickly. And if you don't have spending restraint, if you're not providing tax relief and looking at lowering taxes in this competitive environment, you will lose out. And so this is really important. And I know, like in our paper, and I'll put this in the show notes page on property taxes, we're basically saying, look, let's cap property taxes at 2%. For cities and counties and make sure that they don't grow by more than that. And then that would allow for people's average, their taxpayers' ability to pay for that to not be exceeded by such high property taxes over time, where people are losing their homes or can't afford a home, especially in the situation of an affordability crisis because of a lot of the stuff that the Biden administration and the Fed has done to devalue our dollar. This is a great opportunity for pro-growth policies coming out of property tax reform. So keep up the good work that you're doing there. We can talk about that a lot longer, and I'll make sure to put some more things in the show notes page, John.
And
go ahead.
I just want to highlight for the listeners how much the work you have done. I mean, you have really pioneered across the states the need for conservative budgeting and fiscal responsibility, and so I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. And so I mean, you've been a tremendous leader and trying to bring attention and helping not just us in Iowa but other states. And just, looking at ways to bring budget reform to budgeting, as well as, why it's so important to focus on budget reform and prudent budgeting and fiscal conservatism, because, it's not the most exciting topic, but it's important. And so I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. And so I mean, like I said, I think you're a leading budget hawk. So, I mean,
the ones that are going extinct, right?
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, John, and it's something I love doing. I think we've got to do more of. Yeah. And as you know, it's kind of my calling to let people prosper, and I feel like one of that is to make sure government doesn't grow too much. So I really appreciate that. We'll keep working together on all this as well. All right, so let's get into some other fun stuff. We want to talk about trade. And some of the things we talked about here with Iowa and kind of the Rust Belt area, if you will, just kind of set the stage, I guess, is that there's been a lot of jobs that have been lost in that area. There have been a lot of social ills that have come out over time. And this has brought about, which I think is a good discussion to have, about what's the best way to ensure that we're not being taken advantage of, right, by other countries, that making sure that we're as competitive as possible within the Rust Belt and really across the entire country. And if there are ways to help boost our manufacturing sector and things of that nature. And there's a lot of history to this as we can go through here. And I wanted to give you an opportunity because I know that you and I agree on most everything, and there's some things we don't on trade. You're probably a little more protectionist than I am, or are more protectionist than I am, but there's a history of that, and I would love for you to tell the history of this idea of tariffs and everything else, and why you believe that it's a sound pro-growth policy for the future, because I know you, John, that you want a pro-growth future. And so I know that you're not wanting to do this to be anti-growth or something else, that you really feel like this is going to make us stronger. So I'd love for you to make your case.
Yeah. Well, I really am passionate about this because I come from this from a historical perspective. And I know a lot of people have disagreed with this approach, but from my perspective, the United States and really from the tariff angle, what do you want to call it, economic nationalism or economic patriotism, is the true conservative position. And it's not and I'm not saying it's the libertarian position or even the progressive position, but it's the conservative position. And so if you look at, for example, the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. It starts there where Hamilton, in his report on manufacturers, proposed a system of tariffs and other measures to encourage manufacturing, and that sort of developed into Henry Clay's famous American system, which then was Henry Clay influenced Abraham Lincoln. And that was Lincoln's political hero, and Lincoln, of course, being the first Republican president. And from Lincoln through Herbert Hoover, it's often forgotten, but the tariff was one of the key principles of Republican economic policy during that time period. Was the protective tariff. And if you look at Republican Party platforms during that time period, the tariff is stressed very heavily. It's very influential in the party platform, and it's not just for manufacturing, but protecting agriculture and protecting high wages and workers. And in a sense, it's putting America first. And so, that's sort of a brief history of it in a nutshell. And so, for example, one of my favorite presidents was Willie McKinley. His campaign slogan was the full dinner pail, basically saying that the tariff his two big issues was the tariff and the gold standard led to prosperity, and it benefited the manufacturer, benefited the farmer, it benefited the laborer. And Calvin Coolidge, interesting, also had the full dinner pail as a slogan. And a lot of times Coolidge, Harding and Coolidge are two of my favorites. Coolidge himself, in a speech, and I think it was one of his Labor Day speeches, said that one of the two key provisions that led to economic growth were a protective tariff and restricting immigration. I mean, two controversial issues today, but I think those are two things that we need. In fact, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and they were talking about Senator J.D. Vance about, saying that J.D. Vance favored restricting immigration and protective tariffs. And I thought, that's exactly almost like Calvin Coolidge, favoring those type of measures. And so, the other thing is with, going back to, this idea from a philosophical point, the idea of free trade was really, in the United States, it was really embraced by the progressives. It was embraced by, for example, William Jennings Bryan in the late 19th century. It was really embraced by Woodrow Wilson. For example, he wrote about this in his book, The New Freedom. Wilson advocated this during World War I. It was part of his 14 points. And then it really was picked up by Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. And then Republicans started to pick up on it in after World War II, and so really we started to become more free trade, really as a foreign policy measure in the aftermath of World War II, more so to tie more countries in a sense to us as sort of an anti-communist type of a foreign policy tool to fighting the Cold War. But there was debates in the Eisenhower administration, for example. One individual who I admire was Eisenhower's Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey, who was one of those budget hawks. And Humphrey was a tremendous, who was always harping on the administration to cut spending. But he was, behind closed doors. He was concerned about, the administration embracing more free trade. And so was Herbert Hoover, who was an elder statesman at the time, was warning about the same thing. And Hoover was saying, you continue to lower your tariff barriers, it's going to have a devastating effect on your communities. And one thing too is that when you look at it, we've seen for decades, and I know this is my Pickett's charge here because I'll never win because you're an economist and I'm not. But for decades, we've been running massive trade deficits. And what I've seen is even in my own community where I grew up, is when you see people losing their jobs, whether it's in a mine or manufacturing, it has a tremendous impact on the community. And so when I go back home, for example, a lot of those communities don't exist anymore. But growing up, they had their own festivals. My grandparents would take me to these festivals, and it was, these nice small towns that were thriving. Today, they're all boarded up. There's hardly anything left. And that's, and I think what has replaced that is, in a sense, more dependency on government, more dependency on social services. You see a decrease in the middle class. A lot of people today don't really think the American dream is possible. And so and I'm not saying that, trade deals are to blame solely for this, but,
sure.
But, for example, John Deere in Iowa, just to give you one example, John Deere announced just a few months ago that they're going to shut down a part of their plant in Iowa and outsource it to Mexico. At the same time, John Deere is the leading recipient of Iowa tax credits. They get over $15 million of the research and activities tax credits. Wow. And, they're laying people off right now. And that's understandable because the ag economy right now is uncertain. Yeah. And that can be helped. But why should Iowa taxpayers be subsidizing a corporation when they're going to outsource jobs to Mexico? And Ross Perot was right. When we had NAFTA, it was a giant sucking sound. You basically said you had a reverse effect where you had industries leaving. The same thing when you had MFN for China, you had all the people saying, well, if you bring China in, it's going to be a more friendly competitor. It's going to democratize. Just the direct opposite happened. I mean, we've lost, 4 or 5 million jobs to China. Iowa alone, I think, lost close to over 30,000 jobs to China. And what did we get in exchange? Massive trade deficits. We've built up China's military, and now we're dependent. I was had to go to the pharmacy a few weeks ago to get some medicine, and when I got home, I was just by chance looked at my prescriptions. All 3 of them were made in China. And what COVID taught us is we become so dependent on foreign countries for necessities, for pharmaceuticals, for semiconductors, and I'm afraid that if God forbid we need to become that arsenal of democracy again, do we have the infrastructure to do that? For example, we can't even build ships anymore hardly because we don't have the infrastructure. The other thing is, and I'll stop here. I don't want to go on and on, but even our allies are cheating on trade. So even places like Mexico, Canada, the European Union take advantage of us. And this is where I agree with President Trump on, they're, as he says, they're ripping us off, and they are. So, for example, right now, Mexico was lobbying to get relief from the 25% steel tariff. And so, we do that. And so what are they doing? They're flooding our market with steel now, and that's impacting businesses in Iowa, and that's impacting jobs as well. And And the other thing is what is China doing? They're going to come into Mexico now and start building factories with the sole objective now of flooding our markets. And so the other thing is that, I think, as a conservative, I keep asking myself, what are we going to do? What are we going to conserve as a nation? And I think that's one thing we need to do. And I think too is that, one thing I really liked about J.D. Vance is he said, the United States is not just an idea. We're more than that. We're a people. We're united in a sense of a shared history, customs, language, and so forth. And I think, in a sense, free trade has, and by that, I'm not saying against trade. I want to make sure that people are clear on that. I'm not saying we shouldn't trade. I'm just saying we should be strategic in our trade. And not allow these like Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that was a mistake. I think Trump did a good idea, but I think we've been taken advantage of, and I'm not sure if we can even come back. We've been hollowed out so bad.
No, good points there, John, and that's why I wanted to give you as much time as possible because you've been. You're a friend and you're someone who does this thoughtfully, and not trying to go after other people and things of that nature. You come at it from a good historic standpoint and everything. And I like some of the assumptions that you made that, this is a conservative viewpoint versus other types of viewpoints that are out there. And look, you said that maybe you're not going to win, but because I'm an economist, but at the same time, being a free trade guy, and I make some points here, but I think that in my view, I'm actually losing a lot of the debates that's going on right now because you have the groups, you have like the quote unquote new right that I know we wanted to talk about some, but the new right or national conservatism, whatever you want to call it, kind of this view, which is, I guess, embodied in some sense by Trump, maybe more so by J.D. Vance. But the view of, tariffs, having less free trade, having more fair trade versus free trade. Also, there's other factors that go into that. There's other sort of roles for labor unions. There's other types of roles for other groups that maybe had went on the wayside over time to try to bring back more of a voice for the working class is what I kind of see that is. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yes, and I think one mistake with the new right, and first of all, I would say one mistake with the new right is that some of the writers that identify as new right have embraced the New Deal, and I think that's a mistake. That's a tremendous mistake. I mean, that's barking up the wrong tree as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is that that old saying, you can't outdeal the New Deal, and so we're seeing this in family policy. And right now we're trying to, we become so desperate to encourage the growth of families so now we're in a bidding war of like the family tax credit, the child tax credit. So, let's have let's increase to the 5,000. Well, now 6,000. And, so now we're in this bidding war. We are not going to outbid the Democrats on this. No. And so what I think is that the new right, has made a mistake of embracing the New Deal and in terms of embracing big government, and that's a mistake. And so I would say the new right needs to go back to, I would say, sort of more of like a Pat Buchanan style old right conservatism. Go back to the Harding Coolidge style of old right conservative politics. And that includes the tariff, restricting immigration, and limited government.
No, good points there. And as you know, I've been pretty critical of the new right. I had a piece recently in the American Institute for Economic Research saying, look, we do not need to go in this direction. And it was mainly because of the points you just made of that. I think it's almost like progressivism. It's kind of like the old progressivism they want to go to, including the New Deal and others, instead of thinking about it from a more limited government approach. There's a lot of big government policies that are included in there. And we may disagree on some of the stuff like tariffs, but I think it sounds like we agree that some of the direction they're going is not the direction that we need to go. And just going back to the trade stuff for a minute, because I'll make sure we have plenty of time to talk about this before we wrap up here, which we will soon, is, I'm concerned that if we stifle trade too much, that we will lose out on the benefits that have also come to consumers. Because while the producer, we've talked a lot about workers and things of that nature that have been lost in certain areas, we've forgotten that there has been a benefit to consumers, though, of lower prices and over time, and especially for lower income people, this has given them a way to equalize their consumption much more than ever before because of some of the trade stuff that's gone on. Now, what I usually have a problem with, let's assume that you're right, like the trade stuff and globalization and all that. Contributed to us being less competitive or other countries being more competitive because they could do it cheaper than we could for a number of reasons. China subsidizes a lot of their industries and their workers. Other countries do a lot of other things with their trade. But what I always think, what I don't want to make sure that we don't lose track of is that what are we doing internally to make ourselves less competitive? So in places in the Rust Belt, they had moved to labor unions had a lot of control for a long time that raised the cost. Minimum wages were going up that raised the cost. We had high corporate tax rates at the state and federal levels that made us less competitive. And so and also automation, for better or worse, I think automation has helped us in a lot of ways to be more productive, but it also means you need fewer workers. For example, manufacturing continues to expand. Even globally, we've expanded manufacturing, but at the same time, we in America, even though we're growing manufacturing output, the employment's declined tremendously. And a lot of that's due to the automation that's out there. And I don't know that we want to go back to before having the automation. And so if you try to isolate how much of this is from trade, how much of it is from domestic policies, and how much of it's from automation, like the private market productivity, I wouldn't put as a great of an emphasis on just the trade part, which is my area where I really think we need more free trade. And maybe this makes me much more libertarian. I consider myself kind of lowercase libertarian. A classical liberal is usually what I say. And maybe this makes me less conservative, but I take the kind of the viewpoint of Milton Friedman, where we need free trade. Free trade allows us to best utilize our resources and get the things that we want at the cheapest price and hopefully best quality. Now, it's not always the best quality. I kind of have some issues with that. But if people want to buy it, then at least they have the opportunity to do that. And it allows for more competition within our own country, because even if there is a quote unquote monopoly in America, you still have the rest of the world to compete with. And so that provides competition that can benefit producers, workers, and consumers throughout the marketplace. And so I wonder what some of your thoughts are on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. And there's no doubt about it that we've, certainly the free trade has opened up to a lot cheaper consumer goods, especially in terms of, clothing and stuff like that. My concern is that we're trading in a sense, cheaper TV sets for better manufacturing. So I think even in high tech stuff, we've fallen behind, and so we've allowed the United States basically to, whether it's semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, high tech electronics, things like that, where we don't produce anymore. I'm afraid that we're at a disadvantage, and so for example, we may be seeing where for the first time, Asian countries may surpass us as the leading steel producer. I think Andrew Carnegie would be spinning in his grave at that. But one thing is when I look at the goods of for example, people are still struggling because of high inflation, making ends meet. So products aren't very cheap at Walmart even right now. But I think more so than tariffs, I think the government spending side, devaluing the dollar that way, has done more damage than tariffs have throughout our history, and I think that's more of a problem than tariffs have been. The other thing is that what happens is when we see, for example, a factory gets shut down or outsources to Mexico or something, and those workers go, from making a decent wage, going to work for an Amazon distribution center or maybe Walmart or something like that, going to a service economy. They may be able to still get cheaper goods at Walmart, but they're not. Their living is not the same. And so I think what I think what we're seeing is, we're really outsourcing our economic independence to foreign countries, which really concerns me. And that was something that, that concerned Alexander Hamilton, when he in Washington, understood at Yorktown, we don't want to do this again. They said basically, we don't want to depend on France again for our national defense and our necessities. And I'm afraid that's where we're headed.
Well, and John, I mean, whenever I was at the White House, I had not a lot, but I had a few conversations with Peter Navarro and got to hear his takes on what's going on, and learn from, Robert Lighthizer and his talks as well about, the concerns. For example, Peter Navarro wrote the book Death by China, where they believe, that it's an existential threat. And so therefore you should take whatever tools you can to go after them, which is one reason why I think they were using tariffs as a tool compared to other items that are out there. And maybe why Trump is now talking about a 60% tariff against China, or a 10% tariff across the board, these sort of things. Go ahead.
I just want one more thing, a point I want to just raise is that this is sort of the Harding-Coolidge approach I think would still work today, is that with tariffs and whether you have a strategic tariff or not, but use that tariff. And you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100% on, cutting regulation, cutting tax rates to reduce the cost of business here in the United States, because we should have an internal free market within the borders of the United States. Yeah. Because we, in a sense, can control that market. And that's the founding fathers intended that to be a free market. And we really should have free trade within countries that are basically in even balance with the United States. But in those countries that we don't, then I think that's when the tariff is appropriate. But, when we have the tariff, what we should do is take that revenue then and cut the tax rates, and make sure we cut the corporate tax rates, and make sure we have low regulations to reduce the cost of business and to prevent outsourcing and to encourage business expansion. And so I think that's one thing that we need to do. And that's kind of what Harding and Coolidge did, with the 4D-McCumber tariff. And so
but they also kept spending down, like they were able to keep spending.
Yeah. And the other thing too, it concerns me with some of these trade deals is that it's, a lot of times it's a loss of sovereignty, for example, and I know, some, there's different schools within the libertarian thought, but, you had people like Maury Rothbard and Ron Paul that had opposed NAFTA, for example, because they saw it as managed trade. They didn't really see it as free trade. They saw it as managed trade. And, they saw it as, in a sense, there was parts of that they frankly saw it as unconstitutional, as a loss of American sovereignty. And so, the WTO, for example, basically will say, Congress can't do this because, an international body says, you can't do it. And I don't think that's right. And so we are losing our sovereignty to, unelected international bureaucrats, which is, I think, is a dangerous thing as well. Yeah, no,
it's great points, and it's one that I'm sure we're going to have a lot more conversations on.
Just one more thing. Sorry about that, but one more issue I want to bring up, and that's there's a lot of the new right people. I think too is a lot of times I found out, and just having conversations with people on the new right as well as within the free market circle, is a lot of time there's a lot of focus on China, but a lot of times they'll say, I support maybe putting tariffs on China, but they have no problems with, trade with Vietnam or even Mexico or something like that. So, right now there's a lot of debate on China, but they don't have any problems with, the EU cheating us or Mexico or anything like that. So my approach would be, whether you're an ally or not, I think we need to put America first.
Okay.
And I don't care if it's China or Mexico.
Would that mean, would you be more in favor then of the 10% across the board tariff or something higher?
Yes, I think so. And I know I've seen proposals of a 10% and a 20% tariff, strategic tariff, as they call it. And I think, I was really supportive of the steel tariff. And I think that helped resurrect the industry. But I think, it's a tool that should be used when needed. And I think there's plenty of precedent in our past to use that.
Yeah. Well, I can't say I agree with you, John, and we could go back and forth for a while, which I always love doing.
Yeah.
And I think we need more conversations like this, though, because too often we get into these yelling matches back and forth, and we're not achieving anything that way.
Well,
and I think the whole part of this, when you look back to our founding fathers of Hamilton versus Jefferson or whoever else it may be, they really had a lot of good discussion that brought us forward, and that's what we need more of. And I'm hoping to do that more on this show. But I know you and I will keep talking about this a lot longer. And but I really appreciate your views for sure.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Vance, because, even through our history, the tariff has been one of the more controversial political issues of debate. Back to the founding, as you said, and even leading up to the Civil War, post-Civil War, surrounding the Great Depression. I mean, there's still a lot of debate around the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but but it's a good discussion to have. And the other thing it's frustrating too is, and I know it's controversial, but even immigration. I mean, you can't even have a discussion about immigration without being called a racist or something, and it's unfortunate. But I brought something for show and tell just quick.
Okay.
I got this from an antique store. I don't know if you can see it, but this is this is a copy of the minutes from the 1928 Republican Convention, and it belonged to Senator Reed Smoot.
Wow. Smoot-Hawley?
Yes, yeah. So I thought you'd enjoy that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Where'd you find that at?
It was at an antique store.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. Well, John, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And you've got so much knowledge, and you're doing great things there in Iowa and for the country and for the world. And so I appreciate all you're doing. And God bless you and your family.
Thank you, Vance. I appreciate it.
Where would be the best place for people to find you more or get you more of your information?
We are online at itrfoundation.org.
All right. Okay, great. And I'll be sure to put all this stuff in the show notes page for the audience where they can find it at vanceginn.substack.com, or just go to vanceginn.com. I've got all the information there as well. And, it's always a pleasure to talk with John. I hope the audience learned something today. I know I sure did. Please go out and give us a 5-star rating and share this with your friends and family. God bless you, John, and to the audience. And until next time, let people prosper.